don't damage you. Those who be Tabachuni, Kanjian Baby Gasel answer, choose some baby Sergey Yone, Matu Samachi, Jammer Sensi or Wongoche, Ramon Galan to take up to Madupatan. DJ Paul Woman, you must Shibe, they would detola. Kunjung is a word. German treasure gets also shown, but during the president of Yapio Nanke, Shintukuru, Jamku, Claudia Rocha, Pishnaye. Danashin, German president Yapio Tobe, Tommy Kushab, Wolf, Gang, Greater Chota, Jamku Choki Charo Nanke, Shin, Jam Anya Malotra Cho, Jam Amelie Klossman Cho. Danashin Kushab Ali Majobi Cho Deshin Permitting Zuki Swiss Kuzab Tenje Mudu Doji Choche Pishunaye.
On 10th March 1959, the Tibetans took to the streets of Lhasa, Tibet's capital, rising up against People's Republic of China's invasion and occupation of their homeland. The uprising was crushed by military force and ultimately resulted in killing and injuring tens of thousands of Tibetans. Since then, to honor those Tibetan martyrs and to commemorate that fateful day, Tibetans all over the world observe 10th March every year as the Tibetan National Uprising Day. 10th March 2015, Central Tibetan Administration observes the 56th Tibetan National Uprising Day in the gracious presence of a staunch Tibet supporter, Ms. Claudia Benedicta Roth, Honorable Vice President of German Bundestag, the German Parliament, and Member of European Parliament, along with a delegation consisting of Mr. Wolfgang Greder from the Tibet Initiative Deutschland, Ms. Anya Malhotra and Ms. Amelie Klossman from the German Embassy, New Delhi, and Mr. Ali Majaubi, Personal Secretary to the Vice President, and Mr. Ngutub Doje, Representative of Office of Tibet, Geneva.
Tene Zego Unzu Gitomar, Sama Kushin to Pande, Sigon Kang Losan Sengichogi, Per Gagab Chamber, Gather, Kain Sutin Zunangab, Pergi Doga Tobane, Ngare Tanje, Per Gagab Chamber, Galubugu.
Hoisting of Tibetan national flag by Sikyong Dr. Lobsang Sengye and singing of Tibetan national anthem.
Sangma Kushing to Payton Pemisa Denche, Jebe Luso, Longjet and Jeba, Ledon Nanke, Geje Pau Bomanam Gikatin Jetenta, Nyange Kuduchedo, Ngaje Kamachik Shugu.
1 minute silence to pay respect to those who have sacrificed their lives for the Tibetan cause.
Kamachik Drubayi, Sama Shooting Jaruna. Zerim Sumba, Pegi Doga Togane, Sumju Tenu, Willem Shugu.
Singing of the uprising song by the Tibetan Institute of Performing Arts.
Zerim Shiva Pande Pemiman Chidu Tokzo Pembasirin Choki Pemiman Chidu Hanzoki Sunshe Nangyu.
Mr. Pembasiring, Honorable Speaker, Tibetan Parliament in Exile will deliver the statement of Tibetan Parliament in Exile.
Today, Sumju today tang of Ngaju Tove, Chibunambe, Kundenzo, German Trezo Tolshamba, Jam Claudia Roth, Chodan, Congland Pebe, Kundunamba, Tana Shichi, Talinde, Nanzu Togunimba, Italine Pebe, Milano Bruno, Trezo Tumi Subari, Koran Hengelia, Charo Kajidu. And then I see Ganagi, Chobukajik, Gamiri, Chobukajik, then they pay the Yori. And if they Chimship Chair Ubegi, Manzuko, Sumgitz Namadan, any legislature Sum, Shun the Shunde Maimbe, Tizuka Kuzam number Samalolia, Anthony Sumjuting, Zegutolia, Chiju number Cutting Chesini. Xuedang Terini Chilchidong would younger Nagulo Pure Gesel Hasser, Kamar Kitchen Shaver Pure Mang Rawan Galanchim Shiguchede Milo Shibung of Naruko to Denta Pure Geje Popomo Nimuya Yimbatar Ko Pure Machidun Henzo Subshude Peu tensi miri itondo, luso lonju de jeba, yons le dan na we geje bao bo nam yingdop tang, zesan la jeden tang, dadang gyamar ki changnu siju o dukjong narju nyongshim nam la, dongsim nyamge shuda shujun. Shilchidong go jishu shegulor, gyana mema chidun gekap jeba gonzu gozuma ta ne, peu kanjin shingi nuju yongzo sasem jangde, peu chogasum ji sakyun yons Chagbu Puma Rimjiki, Pumi Bumda Mangbe, Seso Top Mase, Pugi Chusi Laname Uti, General Conscamgon Chimbucho, Puchala, Gagan Samla Neva, Gap De, Chiluchidong of Jangajunga with Dawson Betse Juni, Pugi Gesal Hasar, Gaji Pumi Tonga Mangbu, Madru Samba Chikunki, Gamar Shunda, Gay Wanzi Par, Shigecheve, Shigo, Namdun Tongor, Nawateni, Subto Mebe. Loju ki pangda shi tu chayu Gamar shungi Pyo du wangyur chering Pyo yi loju dangwan la kyoshe dan Tumin rikshung la sele Chode ki rangwan zentro Nuju kuryu la torjom Ndroa mi topdang la dogru Maju rangwan la kakdom Penjo ya ye la kakti Mise bewe ngenju Pyuri chikyu la Pyumi ngondo la kesu cheba so le Dundam Pyogi Goko the Tumbe, Siju Yandabashik, Tabar Lalento, Matarwa Mase, Chanun Dang, Duzu Chengi, Siju Kona Suar Den, Pyogi Mirab Sani, Jemil Madubar, Gashung La Shigu Nawe Rimba, Tabar Samche, Mejing, Tadun, Chisi Pudun, Denda Masepar, Samche Misibe Canadian, Ganag Wanzim Butsu, Shego Bashichayu, Jino. Conscamgon Kunden Chushib Chimbuchogi, Per Kanjin Be Gesi Chusi, Tugan Shiavaneson, Pege Nedun Tundi Yonche, Per Shiji Nisu Tugur Rimshe Zejing, Nobel Shide Sengda Gitsu, Geji Tengen Cheve Sengda Gata Gewa Shenan Zete, Perdun Denta Setup Gizetin Lanameva Gang Yunang, Gana Shungi Goti Rimbe, Kashi Misumbe, Chejo Mbashik De, Tana Gashung Rani Gi Doduntar. Mende Sokane Shajube to do Tunzen Seva Sunje, Deshi Tawadan, Rine Sadi Chembu Ngenka, Yonzo, Mishi Shoga la Geje, Gurju Gonjedan, Siju Lugdon Soki, Mingdo Natso Che Yunang, Dungu, Pedun Mebe Siju Yanda Jik, Tabar Sumeber Den, Jigdong of Yikadun Lor, Pugi Mirab Nibata, Nidong Ge Lor, Pugi Mirab Sumbaso. Gana shungi Dharmarwa to Salon Chua yin serve 벽이 미럽 사반 남기 내치대 라리양 벽이 개살 하세 벽 초가 숨기 사kyun 용네 야나 마슌라 시게체베 시구 림투 자고 투요바당 학월 치료 니동 군에숭 군에 니동 추영아 진짜 숨베체 응아팔 내수 카세 셰도 중화 벽이 갸다 숨주 수루기 개슌르 시거체 랑류 메세 땅데 데이트 대존스 침버 갸다 주 차요버소 응알 시대 행자 수네베 표 춘된기 개컴 대양 탱급 척지 조에 마수기 시라다불 귤고베 겐자 개슌기 표도 진베 장능기 시주당 개슌기 뼈리츠 제조라 투유 야마르기 장능 시주 대wo 표미 봄 중니기 최소 쇼여바당 다동 도종 준주기 장능어 녀와 미유도 표바다비 나주 냥다 용시베 표미 장세니 수경 춘지 미투베 내수 통유 계지 시슌카다 저조兄弟们被错说대체 만다와 망고당 우티 림바지기 실지동 국경 업중어군의 숭 다버 벽이 된된고란 돌랭당 저주 림조 벤조지 튼진소 준난 제요바 남니 버든 계지랑 신전도 주에 봉년당 버든의 갑jor나에 거진 빠도 매버시이냐 등어 버든 된다 셋업이 겐 체슈대 버버랑이기 쿨고바달 시슈 범인난지 닝도당 최선라 샌데브 슈고 마치부다 진호 관습 장군 준비 추억이 의 표기 추규 전부 시다 용주 표제 지역이 우티 라친 폐제소 출시기 통계 시행 망부시 전주도 샵술 코토버 중대 야가르츠베 랑와 룽카도 표기 최다 리슌소기 오 진경 배숨체 만주가와 숨된기 범인 딕주당 범인 두두 시자 사대 시룹 댐베 내시 다르게 버든 댐베 내수 지자 슌게 용라 나댕기 신윤 롭종 제대 시든기 갑주와 현다 만자와 출시 강태네 좀대 간에 퇴연장 미럽 고문남기 제제당 미유 대답 미럽 사바츠 균진 투바 작업에 초요안에 겐쿠르 치시기 투쇼르도 마송와 고바 마세 학월도 미리기 소사 개체슈니 미리테 게이 임베 라르 젠주 라완 롱버 유베 표리 슌게 지당 제라도 높초 유루카 차론 중에 표리 슌게 남기 벽이 게이를 배분 7개 만왕세 닌시 벽에 미션베 표바시도 균년 친구 도베 시슈 표리 슌게 남기 갸슌 유타노 게이 순급체 배주 지나라 미베때데 랑기 랑라 원농 미고바 표바시 차투버 쐴네 자구유 개지차유 데베 로션의 숨 갸슌기 고치 사바츠 원규 제링 개급 경월 탄잠 경고바당 탄잠 경월 벽을 땡링 고골 소르니데 벼랑종종 세베츠 벼민내유 사초 강설 자드 레드 루카 치조 망고다 gondeka도 자드 레드 루카소 땡드 제네 벼민남라 인생 두주도 쏟아제데 군대 출루기 시루 냠셰의 순저당 칩시 마주 라와 니레 초와 쪼고카 두교기 라와 소랑 담다 슈지 제드 제시마다 다동 루송의 독십 제바단 제네 벼미 망볼 달레 카드 링루와 세와 소 년게 나초 제데 벼기 된된의 제베 레든 띵두사면 장와 매버 실루니동 줍시 르난도 양 무투 자다가 니미스 요토 벼미 랑류 메시소 중고고 난고 차여라 때강 오던당 쿠류 도견 참제 매징 많다 둔다 레레랑 벼미 진주 참제 매바 벼기 의중 로규 준수체베 년진 규든 믹세 참마게 맨데워 벼미 카지 마세 당와제 매게 김장 침무시 자와 대나 미리 연재 속이 제조 참만용바대 벼고 떼니 용타 매바다고 차여 지금이동 줍시르 계지 조미 독십 초바 카 망변년되나 변한 그 자라 내당 무투 강에 윤에 세여베 야나기 벼리스 무도 densu당 카셰 되네기 시주 락다르 자규 둘러봐봐 냉구 지규 라레 전주 벼민남기 벼된다 제베 냉구 rik tsam ma cheba pe gu yu yang keje tunjin le song debe chilo ni don chupshi nang pe ma chi du chozo ni gi zebe ji du ka chagu gi shadum gekop mangbor chegyu gi gekop sosu chozo tumiso ne mena khala tude gi pe nang rang lu mese zu ta de zara ne dang kor ngo ju 마음 배도는 갑결 용탑 속이 슈두 림제를 된제 간레 순두바 중요하다 하든 야가르기 급주르베 저조 오메 투미 살페다 제 저조 공업이 투미 결할 투제기 야가르 저조 투미 배도는 야교 소발라스 슈 군주 슈신유 다대 변한 그 자라내당 신점 용당다 용탑다 배도는 이간용 셋업체 안주응원에 배장님의 우면람이 토네 주면 용탑 자규 출심라 교학한 매버때 자나미마 지준 계급기 고지 최장 예가 윤지 매버 두줄 담진기 벽에 되면 뉴르도 투급의 냉구 지규 대링 고급 디단 뛰네 전주 표면남을 거딘 하라도 최외 야가를 슈만인기 주 배도는 투구를 잡교 난겐다 표면서 튕겐 조주 난겐기 계급단 소바 미게르제라 시제 표면 용기 섭슈데 투질라메드 최슈슈리인 타든 저니동 줍시 신 표면 뒷주 가샤 응원에 진영 건설 장군 침부초 거딘 제정기 로지송 슈여버신 표마 지둔 현조 응원에 강 공복 항의기 댄주 된도 랍신기 공시다 제진 다시 참을 순지 전초를 침부토 두지까지 라면도 제시 슈와다 라리안 감숨 댄주 공부 담발 샤베 깨게버도 미규 땜바 슈베 소와 제직도 대버제 표마 지둔 현조네 I'm sure our Honorable Sikyong will definitely speak more elaborately in English, but I take this opportunity to thank the Vice President of Bundestag, Ms. Claudia Roth, for sparing her time to come here, braving the diplomatic row that will ensue, definitely. And despite her busy schedule, I want to thank her for her presence today. And I also wish to thank our friend Bruno Milano, who was a former member of the Italian Parliament, accompanied by his friends and our Chinese friends. As you know, the most recent case of self-immolation has happened on the 5th of this month. And the number has unprecedentedly increased to 136, out of which 117 people have already died. This is, in fact, unprecedented in any history of any country in the world. Not that many number of people have self-immolated for the cause of their own nation. And we consider this act of self-immolation as the highest form of nonviolent action. None of these 136 people who self-immolated have tried to harm any of the Chinese, whether it's military or civilian. This is symbolic of the grave situation inside Tibet. Most of the self-immolators were between the age of 17 to 35. These people have not witnessed the Chinese invasion of Tibet. Neither have they witnessed the cultural revolution that had taken place in Tibet, which resulted in the deaths of 1,200,000 people, Tibetan people, and destruction of more than 6,000 monasteries. They only witness what the Chinese government is doing to Tibet today, the policies and programs that they implement. Politically, any Tibetan, whether be it a religious teacher, be it a writer, intellectual, be it a singer, be it an environmental activist, be it a businessman, anybody who has any influence on the society are targeted and apprehended in the name of national security. Religious freedom does not exist in Tibet. Reconstruction of monasteries are just a facade of just a facade, just to show to the outside world that monasteries are being rebuilt. But what is actually needed inside Tibet is practice of religion and in maintaining the religious institutions. There are so many restrictions. If a novice monk has to join a monastery, that novice monk has to criticize the Dalai Lama. And His Holiness also knows about it. That's why His Holiness always says, don't worry about criticizing me if you get the freedom to practice religion. All the sensitive monasteries, what they call as sensitive monasteries, wherever events have happened before, are being targeted. They are being monitored regularly with now numerous numbers of CCTVs that have been put in place. Monks and nuns does not have the freedom to move inside Tibet as they wish. Even with 4 or 5 different permits that they have to obtain, they still have to live under constant monitor and constant fear. Moreover, the atheist communist government wants to be responsible for reincarnation of Tibetan lamas, which has been used as a political tool and which they intend to use in future also as a political tool. And one of the most important concerns for the Tibetan is Tibet's environment. And I'm sure the Deputy President here, as a foremost leader in the Green Party or the Green International Organization, spearheading environmental issues, will definitely take up this issue more seriously in the future, in the times to come. Because the environmental issue of Tibet not only concerns Tibet. We Tibetans call ourselves the land surrounded by snow mountains. Westerners came to Tibet and called it the roof of the world. Today, Chinese environmental scientists call Tibet as the third pole, because Tibet has the largest amount of glaciers and permafrost that feeds all these major rivers, that flows into 10 different countries: Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Burma, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam, and also into China, which are, in fact, the most densely populated areas in the world. We are very aware of the fact that solution to Tibet can come only from China. We don't expect the United States or the NATO to fight for Tibet, just like the United States did in Afghanistan or Iraq. And nor can the Tibetans fight the Chinese militarily, which definitely goes against our philosophy and way of life. Therefore, the only solution is dialogue. And I take this opportunity to urge the Chinese leadership to resume dialogue meaningfully based on His Holiness' proposal and the policy that the Tibetan Parliament has unanimously adopted, the middle way approach. This in no way goes against the position of the Chinese government, nor the position of any of these countries who follow one China policy. I am to understand, as the session of the National People's Congress is going on in People's Republic of China, they have also decided to form the 6th Tibet Walk Forum. And under the leadership of President Xi Jinping, now that he had assumed all the powers, be it military, political, I urge the Chinese president not to miss this opportunity when the Tibet Walk Forum starts functioning. They take all the Tibetan aspirations into consideration and come out with policies and programs that meets the needs of the Tibetan people. And in that sense, as I mentioned before, the solution for Tibet can come only from China, but we need the international support to push the process further. Therefore, your presence here, Honorable Vice President, is very significant, and thank you very much again for being here. Thank you.
Zerim ngawa German Chozo ki Sozu Shemba Kurwe Jam Claudia Roth Choki Sung Shenangyu.
May I request Honorable Vice President Ms. Claudia Roth to address the Assembly.
Mr. Speaker, dear Dr. Lobsang Sangay, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, friends of the Tibetan people, my dear Tibetan family. Today is really a special day for every Tibetan and a special day for human rights worldwide. We have gathered here in Dharamsala to mark the 56th anniversary of the 1959 Tibetan Uprising. This uprising is an important chapter in Tibetan and, indeed, in recent world history. This day has become a symbol for self-determination and the right to a homeland. So being here with you today is a very special, a very emotional, touching moment for me. Many of you were forced to leave Tibet, forced to leave your families, your country, and you found sanctuary here in India. So today really is a day to celebrate and give thanks. Thank you for 56 years of non-violent resistance of the Tibetan people. Thank you for your strength and your commitment. Thank you for your courage. Thank you for your endless patience. And thank you because the Tibetans have become a voice of hope and a voice of and understanding throughout the world. Thank you, Tibetan family. I would like to thank Dr. Lobsang Sangay, Prime Minister of the Central Tibetan Administration, for inviting me to visit Dharamsala as a friend of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and as a friend of the Tibetan people. Dear friends, 80,000 Tibetans lost their lives in the Tibetan uprising in 1959. But the tragedy of Tibet began earlier with the invasion of the Chinese People's Liberation Army in 1949 and 1950. At the time, the world paid no attention. There were many reasons for this. Post-war Europe was still in chaos. The beginning of the Cold War and the former colonies in Asia were engaged in their struggle for independence. These, rather than Tibet, were the issues preoccupying the international community. It was only with the uprising and the events in Lhasa on the 10th of March 1959 that the world started to take notice of the terrible problems facing the Tibetan people. The message sent by the uprising, the desire for freedom and self-determination, and its continued commemoration and remembrance are important sources of hope and of strength, which are so important for the Tibetans today, 56 years after the uprising was crushed so brutally and His Holiness the Dalai Lama was forced into exile. March 10th is a day of immense significance. It is a warning from history as we commemorate the past. It is a day for being mindful of our responsibility for the present. And it is a day of remembrance for a better future. So today is a day against forgetting. And I am worried that the Tibetan people's struggle, which has justice on its side, might be forgotten by the world community. So today is also a day against silence and indifference. My message to the international community is this. Like Daniel Mitterrand said, don't forget that the Tibetans forgetting kills. Or, like the author and Nobel Prize laureate Elie Wiesel once said, to forget the victims is to kill them a second time. We won't forget, dear friends. Countless Tibetans fled after the uprising, and many more are still being forced to leave their country. Today, around 200,000 Tibetans live in exile. For such a small nation, indeed for any nation, too many people have been uprooted and too much has been lost. These Tibetans have suffered the loss of their people, the loss of their homeland, the loss of their culture, and the loss of their freedom to determine their own future. For far too long, the Tibetans in exile were regarded as nothing more than representatives of a reactionary feudal clique in line with an anti-democratic ideology promoted for decades by the Chinese rulers. Since then, the image of the Tibetans worldwide has changed. Today, the Tibetans are recognized as victims of callous great power politics. The Tibetan struggle has become a symbol of peace. This is due not least to the wise policies pursued by His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Central Tibetan Administration here in Dharamsala. I would like to take the opportunity to express my most profound respect and gratitude to Tenzin Gyatso, the fourth Dalai Lama. At a time of so many wars, at a time of so many dreadful crises, the Tibetans and indeed the international community have a figurehead who, throughout the world, has come to symbolize building bridges instead of widening divisions, the charting of peaceful pathways for and into the future, and freedom from bitterness about the past. The Dalai Lama truly is a Nobel Peace Prize laureate, for he is truly an ambassador for the vision of a world without violence and oppression, a world without hatred and exclusion. These are the principles which guide his life and his struggle. He is an ocean of wisdom, a spiritual power, the embodiment of endless compassion, kindness, and love, who never fails to bring sunshine into our hearts, even when dark clouds are gathering overhead, and who dries our tears of despair with smiles and with hope. Hope for a world free from hate and repression, a world which, thanks to people like the Dalai Lama, still seems within reach. We will not accept that the 21st century national power interests and the politics of violence continue to determine international relations and violate day by day international law and the International Charter of Human Rights. That is why I support the Tibetan people and the Tibetans' non-violent resistance out of deepest conviction. So today is also a day to stand together, to send out a strong signal. It is a political day, for it is a day for human rights, and these human rights that are universal and indivisible. And yet in Tibet, they are trampled underfoot, they are ignored every day. The Chinese government way of dealing with the Tibetan people is incompatible with fundamental human rights and incompatible with democracy. The Tibetan people are being forcibly deprived of their rights. The right to self-determination, the right to physical integrity, the right to life, the freedom to practice their religion, and freedom of faith and culture. Flying the flag for Tibet means demanding that China finally abandons its blockading tactics, finally engages in serious and credible political dialogue in its own interest, and finally end the ongoing repression. In its 2014 Freedom in the World report, released in January, Freedom House ranked Tibet worst of the worst alongside North Korea, Syria, and Saudi Arabia, describing them as the world's most repressed societies. Repression such as the rectification campaign and the arbitrary restriction of religious freedom opens the way for the Chinese authorities' destruction of religious sites, the monasteries, and the money stones, which are such a characteristic feature of the Tibetan landscape. The expulsion of 26 nuns from a nunnery in Driru because the official number of nuns had allegedly been exceeded. The 6 months of compulsory so-called patriotic education for nuns and monks accused of the nebulous offense of political involvement, and punishment for citizens found to possess only a photo of the Dalai Lama. Repression such as inequality in schooling, when every subject must be taught solely in Chinese, and the Tibetan people's mother tongue is merely taught as a foreign language. Repression such as forced resettlement, but also the forced settlement of Tibetan nomads in so-called socialist villages, which pose a threat to traditional nomadic life and certainly cannot be said to improve the lives of the Tibetans concerned. And repression such as the systematic surveillance of monasteries by in-house police units. This attempt to bring the monasteries under government control is a provocation which worsens tensions and further embitters the Tibetan people. All these forms of repression are unbearable. So for me, it is a matter of course that in Germany, that in Europe, we show solidarity with Tibet and fill this solidarity with life through our vigorous advocacy for the rights of the Tibetan people. Today is also a day to voice our concern, our most heartfelt concern for the many prisoners like Lama Khenpo Kartse, who was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison based on spurious allegations and accusations. He has been in prison since December 2013 and his health is steadily worsening. Prisoners like 20-year-old Losang Gyatso and 19-year-old Losang Tempa, both are monks at Kirti Monastery in Gagba, who staged solo peaceful protests for freedom for Tibet and for the Dalai Lama, and who were sentenced to several years in prison where they have been tortured. Like the prisoners in Loshu, who are being denied medical treatment by the authorities, despite being seriously injured when security forces opened fire on protesters last March. And if that wasn't enough, the authorities then arrested all the males in the protesters' home village of Shugba. All these people and many others are campaigning for human rights, are campaigning for freedom, are campaigning for protection of the environment, for the protection of Tibet's natural resources, which are essential to sustain life, are campaigning for the preservation of the Tibetan people's rich culture and for the Tibetan language. And this is definitely not a crime, but this is a fundamental right which belongs to everybody and belongs also to the Tibetan people. Therefore, I call for the immediate release of all political prisoners in Tibet. Dear friends, change is essential, and change is possible as long as we don't look away and don't let ourselves be intimidated by pressure from China. So today is really a day against silence and indifference. We stand here today under the open sky with a little bit of snow on the rich soil of Indian democracy, the world's largest democracy, in Dharamsala, not far from your home country, which lies just beyond these mountains. Perhaps the people in Tibet will hear our heartfelt messages in their hearts, messages that are carried to them by the strong wind of the Himalayas. This is our message. Let the people in Tibet live in freedom. Give them the power to decide their own destinies. Give Tibetan culture the opportunity to thrive and to flourish. This is our message to the Tibetan people. The leaders in Beijing don't want to hear any talk of the Tibetan people's rights. The People's Republic of China prefers to criminalize the Tibetans and ensure that the Tibetan representatives' advocacy for their people never bears fruit. Of course, as a world power, China should not be underestimated. The reality is that its global contacts and integration into the world economy make China a force to be reckoned with. Indeed, China is well on the way to becoming a global power. China is already the world's second largest economy after the United States. China's total military budget is also the second largest in the world after the US. But in order to assert its claim to a leadership role in the international community, there needs to be cultural leadership, which is provided for so long by the American dream. So let me ask the politicians in Beijing this. What about the people around the world who are pleased that China is emerging as a world power? How are they supposed to support China if China tramples the human rights of its own people underfoot? If China oppresses, enslaves, and expels an entire nation? If China is unable to safeguard peace and understanding in its own country? This is my message to the politicians in Beijing. Find a way of reaching agreement with the Tibetans, the Uyghurs and the Mongolians, end the repression, and once again, release all the political prisoners in your jails. That would be such an important symbol for the world community, a symbol of peace and understanding. Such a move would be worthy of China's status as an emerging world power instead of the fearful policy of oppression that is reminiscent of the 18th century. And there is something else that a world and regional power like China cannot afford: the fact that Tibet not only possesses a rich and diverse culture, its natural environment is equally rich and diverse and is of vital importance for the Asian and global ecosystems. Tibet is sometimes known as the third pole, like the speaker already mentioned, seeing that 1/6 of the world's glaciers are found in Tibet, seeing that Tibet contains the world's third largest ice mass after the Arctic and Antarctica. But we see that 20% of Tibet's ice mass has already vanished, and 50% is likely to disappear in the next 40 years, seeing that Tibet's 1.6 million square kilometers of permafrost contain more than 12 million tons of climate-killing CO2, and seeing that global warming affects Tibet more severely than the rest of the world. Seeing all this, the vital importance of Tibet's natural environment should be obvious to everyone. Tibet is also known as the water tower of Asia. Yes, seeing that 70% of the water in the Ganges comes from the Tibetan glaciers, seeing that the glaciers also provide 30 to 50% of the water rivers, yes, in India, in China, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, in Nepal, in Vietnam, in Thailand, and in Cambodia. Seeing that in China alone, 300 million people depend on water from the Himalayas. Seeing that the total number of people who depend on Himalayan water is 1.3 billion. But the glacier melting, it results in less water, in less rainfall. It worsens the sandstorms in China. It accelerates soil erosion. And in other words, if Asia's water tower dries up, there will be more deserts and less water. And yet, the Chinese government is planning to build more reservoirs. Uncontrolled mining is adversely affecting the rich fauna and flora of Tibet and polluting groundwater. Heavy industry and a massive increase in traffic are causing black soot deposits on glaciers, which according to the NASA are the cause of half of all glacial melt. New dams do not only destroy nature, but also threaten the survival of farmers, of the whole culture in the rural areas. That's why, dear friends, today is also a day for the protection of the climate and the environment, and to praise the deity Kavalori, to praise the deity of eternal snow. The Tibetan culture and religion would never allow such destruction of the environment. Here, Chinese politicians can learn a lesson from Tibet. They can learn how to protect the precious resources that the Chinese urgently need for their own survival. The Tibetans can only respond to Chinese might with intelligence, honesty, a sense of realism, and an iron will to gain their freedom. That's why the course adopted by the Central Tibetan Administration and the Dalai Lama, namely to achieve genuine autonomy through dialogue and non-violence, is the approach that we must support out of a sense of conviction, but also out of realism. As a human rights activist and a politician who believes in realistic policies, I know how difficult it is to advocate for a policy that holds no promise of rapid results. I know how strong despair can be in the face of seemingly unsurmountable obstacles. The middle way approach pursued by you in Dharamsala is a genuine exercise in a diplomatic balancing act. It is fraught with risk. And the Tibetan people don't need me to tell them about the dangers of walking a steep and difficult path. You know the mountains well and have walked them in all your lives. But this middle way approach is underpinned by the Dalai Lama's own philosophy. The philosophy that he teaches and whose message is that all conflicts can be resolved through sincere dialogue, if conducted in a spirit of openness, if conducted in a willingness to move towards reconciliation. It is up to China to make use of the Tibetans' openness and willingness for dialogue in order to move towards a peaceful and partnership-based solution to the Tibet question. Without a joint approach very soon, we must expect the situation in Tibet to become even more complicated. Beijing's economic and military might cannot and will not solve the problem. An escalation of the situation in Tibet is not a prospect that any of us wants to witness. More escalation and radicalization will claim more lives and cause even greater loss. That is something we would wish on anyone, for every life is precious. But the situation is escalating. We see this from the alarming rise in the number of self-immolations. And no, dear friends, today is also a day of mourning and remembrance for the 136 people, perhaps more, the monks, the nuns, the school children who have burned themselves to death. I am profoundly moved by this expression of their despair. It is a silent scream for solidarity with the Tibetan people. That's why today is also a day of solidarity. Solidarity is vital. And to make it crystal clear, to express solidarity with you, with the Tibetan people, does not mean to be an enemy of the Chinese people, not at all. And so I stand here to express our solidarity with you. Our remembrance of the victims of the 1959 uprising is as vivid today as it was 50 years ago. Tibet has not been forgotten. Today, hundreds to self-determination and a right to dialogue. The Tibetans are ready for this dialogue, as I have learned in all my encounters here in Dharamsala, for a credible dialogue. So China should take heart and open itself up to dialogue. That is surely a hallmark of a state's true greatness. I myself have a profound belief and heartfelt conviction that the solution to the Tibet conflict can only be found in dialogue. So today is a day of dialogue and of outstretched hands. Freedom and human rights are universal and indivisible. The Tibetan struggle and the living example of the Dalai Lama have become symbols of the universality of human rights all over the world. My profound wish is that China will soon move forward on this issue so that you will soon be able to live in freedom and contentment in your own country. My dear friends, I am honored to join you in this profoundly moving ceremony of remembrance. I will never forget, and be sure we will never give up. Tashi Delek.
Zerim Tuba Pemi Chapsi ki Oti Pande Sikyong Kyong Losan Sengi Choki Kasha ki Sungshe Nangyo.
May I request Dr. Lobsang Sengye, Sikyong Central Tibetan Administration, to deliver Kashak's statement.
Honorable Vice President of German Bundestag, Claudia Roth, thank you from the bottom of my heart and on behalf of 6 million Tibetans for giving such a passionate, detailed, very engaging speech, and it means a lot to the Tibetan people. Once again, thank you very, very much. When we met in Hamburg last August, when I extended the invitation, Honorable Claudia Roth said, yes, I will come to Dharamsala. Obviously, many politicians make their promises, but they don't keep. But Claudia Roth is one of the very few who not only says what she means, but she actually does what she means. So welcome to Dharamsala. And your message of support, solidarity for human rights in Tibet, for environmental protection in Tibet, and your reverence and respect and your friend, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and to the Tibetan people will be heard by 6 million Tibetans and all those Chinese leaders you wanted to hear, despite the fact that there was an interruption in the microphone. Your voice was loud enough. I can say it went straight from Dharamsala to Lhasa to Beijing. You are indeed a true friend of Tibet, and you have spent your whole life advocating human rights, advocating environmental issues, against death penalty, and today your presence sends a message of hope, sends a message of freedom, sends a message of justice to all those Tibetans who are suffering on a daily basis. They will look up and say, Honorable Claudia Roth came to Dharamsala and expressed her support and solidarity to us. We will remember her for years to come till freedom is restored in Tibet and His Holiness Dalai Lama returns to Tibet. Thank you very much. Tande nganzu kundenso Claudia Roth shone sungshe shibsu thagwa dana shi chowade dembe thone gyabgyo chimbe yebe thone sungshe namadela ning thagwane tujiche shuya thang kesa dega khona dindi shuche dega dindi sisabi shugula anu shela kabla khona gya phedön thola thona yeba dana shi gyabgyo yeba an phö nang phimitso ge doami ta khoyu ne ta K Yundo Kabla, Kuna Simgu Teba, the Sungwe Kabla, Soa Shukshumbo Tone, the Pege Shuba Imbeina, when a mixtura, Danche, and Soa Shukshumbo Tone, Sunsu, the Yundo Kuna Deng and Zukasha, Wene, the Perochi, Shechi, Shubatar, Tarinde Peche. Gabjog number 2 Tubati, Dendera, Beijing Limbeinea, Ganashung Limbeinea, Daniel Savage Tuyore, Danashi Pearl Yube, Nanzui, Unera, Tungi Dagoso Imbeinea, Franz Ningdo, Yushab Top, Ningdo Payatan, Zenjul Yube, Chige Kal Yube, New Mina, and Pedon Gabjotso, Gabjon Nangetol Imbeinea, Dendera, Karsure, Pedon Tola, Gabjochinge, New Mina Zamling Yuba. Nang ne and Claudia Rocho de Dharamsala Peshas Shichi, Gagua Chik Dan, Simshuke Guachik, Chade which Munzin Chigu, the songs are Kerdu, Miman Sub Shushe, Claudia Rodla, and Ning Tagbane, Tujiche Shui. Adanish Neja, Kashane, Bezin Shuche, and the Tenge Sumji Tude Kabla, European Union, Commission. European Union name in the German and Chick chair, and Dana she a Nobel laureate Singda Shingi, Jody Williams, Shirin Ibadi, and Dana she Nejara, and Himachaliki, Chijab Lunche, De Pevada, and Dana she Arine Chidi Ki, and Tungbar, and Dana she Pebeg Mixe de Duba, Sarasuol. Zuba and Kunda number de Rimbe Dendishua, Business Shugu, and Quan number Peva de Lai, Gadin Chimbu in Che Shui, Tuchena. Think Sunday Jalushu, Chino, Consajam Chimbu Chola, Kuja Gundu Tande, Diripebe, Gabnegindu de, Manzo Kausum Gizazonamba, German Turzo, Solzo, Shumba Jam Claudia Rod, Kitsube. Chinang Kuda number, Rawan Ching, Legun Kagi, Genzin, and Shungde, the Shungde Maimbe, Tobakagi, Genzin, the Leje number, Geje Mangzo, Tan Zeve, Lubtu number Namla, Chilunidong Chunga, Sumji to Den Tank, Ngapchung Nadube, Top, Benden Sigo Chogi, Belbe, Yongchap, Sungshe, Chushawache, Chilujidong Gujingapchung Adu, Chindusumbe, Chunin, Pegi Gesal Hasar, Shive, Rawan Gerlang Che de Milungap Chungadu, Koveg Nimudir, Shije Pimiyongtan, Zamli, Kangsar Nebe, Pegi Toban Namla, Samdi Shuva the Chapchi, Tapar, Tensi, Mirig, Tundu, Luso Longju Le Tangwe, Geje, Pau Pamu Yongtam, Tadechar, Kadu Nyong Shimba Namla, Jeden Kudu Shugui. Teringi Nimudini, Puri Chiu Namde Yone, GC Pede, Dendamaseki Par, Lotub Chimbu Gone, Pemi, De Tabsu, Mutu, Chagui, Chesim Ganang Tang, Consijabgun Chimbuchoki, Tenang Zebe, Tseme Shive, Tadubla Yije Tembu Gone, Jujui, Tamja, Tenso, Shuve Nimushikyan Re. Tadechar, Pernang, Cho Chigne, Yanan Shungi, Tamda Cheru Tangte, Zada Jisher Neyoba Tang, Cho Shen. Jiminyam par Pumi, Ningto Shumber par Neyo, Tanyang Chiluni Dong Gelor, Pe, Choga Sum Yongla, Shigul Chimi Chungwe Jetang, Ranglu Meseki, Shigul Mutu Chungwe Wangi, Pekul Yongla, Tamda Chimbo, Cheshimbatang, Kebar Sane Penzu War, Dushu Chegu Sunsir Tang, Tamda Chimbo Chimi, Bena, Tonger Chega Tu, Dushu Chegap. Sasung Lamga Rimba Mangbo, Jugotab, Motor Laker, Tutag, Nyamdu Kergo, but Teren, Pemitsu, Motor Laker, Lutan, Timashin, Matelvar, Kerna Mato, Kangdu Yang, Dochogi Mindu, Che, Joshin Kangdar, Rang Lungbar, Rangi, Kangdo Rawan Mebe, Nedang Chayoba Tang, Tana, Geri, Yugotojan, Tune Gang, Pen Nang, Nedang Ni, Maxar Lebatang. Chiksung Redu Che Joye Kebar Nalo Yana U Shune Shigatse Dan Chamduni Tongkirgi O Gurgui Seda Chebani Semzab Kishir Nang Benjo Kongbel Tang Tengrabki Yargela Gasu Shuba Shik Yinayang Taparki Nyamnyongla Shigna Tenda Yargeki Pemi Tok Kele Kyongcheva Chungye 동계르기 넘버사와 죽준 제베 데부르 페미르 벤조르기 고급 다냐마토바 마세 유기 다고 오만남 림신 지조기 텔네 탈라 뷰두기여 대베준 세슈니 하사 동계르인 해세 뉴고르도 동라 서버 죽준 숙체 제대 야나기 싱젠 망본네 민보르 편진 내비 제겐 페밀레 신의 레베 초미 당보르 답카시기 망와 차대 로유토 년다 체베 페미 추리기 때문에 하사 통계를 대양 야나기 통계를 현당 다와 교르스버레 대르텐 시것세다 참도 니강 하사당 다버 페미 추리 곰술 순격 자율 매버 교르년 체바탕 대신 벽이 나외 싱조기 초와의 양 도부 숙체 탭신발 양 샘삽유 공슬 변난기 내드남 동래 자귤 까색 여장 만수 무트 냠룹토 최심 때문에 배전 채나 강일 타다 동래 제투배 이제유 대배 뒤소항 둔좀 체모서바탕 대신 릭네 사제 작배 윤배 제주 뺄갑강 범위 닝톱 슈범메버 내여징 대충 치료 직동 국제 기축 계굴로 하사 작배 팀시 담바탕 카델랑 오글 기 민토 내 범위 톡 독대 찬엔길 레굴 뺄와 셴야 누규 퉁게 체모 서바 속 도나 대베 밀로 투주 겔베 링 자나 슝네 직주 니투기 탑람 나소 규 레굴 림바 베여룽 페미리기 닝도탕 라자 냠녜기 도줄레 독대 공토르 펠유 베남 다당안주의 제된 휴심바 치료 직동 급정압 중 아굴로 중외 라왕 갤랑기 레굴탕 치료 니동 갤로 배 야갑도 중외 서지 시골 체메체 롱어주다 카시 링 뚜마르 중외 시외 오글기 레굴 르마탕 학드 타바르 베미 갸타 겔베 라운루 메세 나와 제네 베미리기 덴데 탑즈 무투 냉에 임바 세버 통투 다대차 베낭 첩시기 고도탕 미리기 라르셰 체루 도심바니 로법 게시르낭 태양 베낭 시림망소기 삼베 케르초탕 녜가 켄즈이 녜좀기 낭된탕 루시기 칙된 리무베 디베 리무 초된 속 강내 대강 범위 직질기 누톱 체루 도신유 리카르 야자 공부 투켄기 미망 내 눔코르동켄 탕 대신 싱바단 독바 케바단 규젤와 겐두파드 쯔마 속 상매 범위리기 체통탕 범위 투모마 임베 오보 순접 다르베 용탑라 심쿠르 제신유 상주기 규바티다기 림신 범위 원드 두바 펜도 녜신 용주인 로틸 야나슈네 베랑종 종 서베 운예네 롱업주 코르베 제고 벨처르 여바탕 베낭 랑킴 랑다 용출기 티다 슉체 제신 여룽 티다 제바따르기 랑킴 랑다 용바 베기 징종 개왕 범위 저고베인 대충 신진 신친핑기 당류 미리기 서클도 여베 게리 레제베 쳬 당류 미리기 게이 롭종 제고술 속셰 도장 닝외 도메 쿨도 산에 뻬리기 된제 니슈 쟁기 다캡 직당외 난 범위 최릭단 게이 니게 토 나르하 담다 제주 임바 세부 코 독발 창매 이섭 작업바 난 대충 파메 내 규베 범위 최리 곰시탕 야랍 상저 남 미토네 미토파 균진 투바 고시 땡기차르 베낭 지게르 니거 종구 체외 마메베 군저 남굴 샬린 로레탕 강중 쇼바 겐제탕 창라 릭라 쮸케 뇽두 드이 여독바 나우저 슈주탕 마음바라양 대릭 미용과 자고의 버글 자규인 학바르 신유토 누슈 디규닌 개체슈의 인답 뱀이 창매 개체 된체 찌대 무투 체르냠대 나로 슈규인 가샤기 외에 배대 간요 셋업 수 카젤 마임바 명든 총배 랑조르 용탑기 님의 우멜람기 시주 무투 락다르 체단 치미인 딜로 진의 당배연 낭 백의 심을 내든 속중기 총도 공조 휴대 배연낭의 내단타 계지 첩시기 규제 제라 식대 데메골 30 되둘 10룩 제여징 범위 고티기 konsekabgen chimbu choge guzab thang gyanan shungi goti war demelgi lamne pöden kanyo setup chegyu teni tablam sangshu yimbe yiche tembu cheshinye diite ninge ari chisi lekhungki dinzabe konsekabgen chimbu choge guzab thang gyanan goti war delme chegyur gyabjorgi setup bel dokbar jesu yerang shugyuyin tenya seda nang 데밀기 데부 상부디 야나미만 쥐튀인 야캅 난 예베 미리 창만 케빈 용규 임발 난수 이제 지기 예베 야나 슝기 konsekabgen chimbu chotan deme chegyu kokap tamzin chagwe shekho yobtang 대중 신신 오바마 초네 강 어리 개용 ngadu mellam solde 제고의 cấp konsekabgen chimbu cho니 참제 냠레 난겐기 우티 랍진식 임바탕 콩라 때네 난소르 도와미 체동탕 라왕기 된도 랭롱 제고베 심굴 탭기 예독 제 송바량 가수슈규이 야가른 낭라 차츠나항 베데 켈강 첨부 임베 문지 지체르 도심바탕 베데골 랭롱 제규이 딩자탕 고카 망두 도미 임바 마세 베미 딕수니 양 양탑에 망조의 람루 락다르 체킹기 딕수 누부듬비식 임베 문진탕 댕조 톱신유 망조기 냠슈라 때네 전줄 범위 망조 착수부 중과 인답 마원바량 망조의 레림나 망조네 무투 차시 망점 랑규이 구마 제규인 딜로 잠링 강사르 베미리 베미탕 베된 갑조로와 남내 konsekabgen chimbu cho chilu kongdan gechur pebe gadön zego geba sungzi shushin yu tenin nganzo konsekabgen chimbu cho kuzi shabe temba tang tushe malul hungi duba yongche melam soldeb shujtang 베미리 ki kenor pamene gyube yarab sangbe shiju tang gomsul nam 균sen 투바 체규이 최셈 깨고 다레기 고급 디던 뛰네 잠리 칸사 네베 페미 데던라 샤자 잡조르난킹기 소게리 용라 투지시 슈주탕 학드 야가르 슝타 미만니네 타바 동포 쳔베고네 tunju로람 나와 닝네 거진 제된 슈주인 땡갑 잠리 칸사르 타글레데 투즈 슈크체르 캡심베 급딜 베미 탑즈니 타치기도 세메 시베 탑람 와시글레 때네 템버식 인답 게지 지조네 무투 갑조르 차여버식 차여바 세주 자도 중 다들 konsekabgen chimbu cho kuze shabe tenjing tuje malil hungi dubatang pöden dentan yurdu selde shije nyamzum gi kesang gi nima yurdu shabe mendu shugdadan che sejong gi chilo nidong chuanga chindu sumbe che chula tuchana inji to kasha sungjin jalo shuchobache honorable chief guest Claudia Roth, and we have special guest from I Am Sweden, Anne Stevenson, who is the Secretary General of I Am Sweden, and former Member of Parliament Bruno Milano, and some of the Chinese friends are also here with us. And also I would like to particularly mention Wolfgang Grader, the President of Tibet Initiative Deutschland for being here today on this very special occasion. We are gathered here to remember the brave men and women who gave their lives for the cause of Tibet 56 years ago. We are also here to remind ourselves to carry forward the non-violent struggle of the Tibetan people with great determination, courage, and resolve. My fellow Tibetans, I report to you that the situation in Tibet remains grim, but the enduring spirit of the Tibetan people is strong and getting stronger. Ever since the 2008 peaceful protests erupted and the ongoing self-immolation protests throughout the plateau, Tibet is under virtual lockdown. Restrictions on movement of Tibetans have greatly intensified. At multiple checkpoints in major urban centers under constant surveillance cameras, Tibetans must swipe their identity cards that are embedded with sophisticated second-generation chips. As one Tibetan has described this indignity, your identity card is your like shadow. Without it, you cannot move. The situation of increased restriction is so excessive that even Chinese tourists have been moved to comment that the present conditions in Tibet are like a war zone. Of particular concern to Tibetans is the China State Council announcement in 2014 to upgrade the status of the towns of Shigatse and Chamdo to that of cities. Though Tibetans welcome economic development in the form of modernization, their experience in the face of urbanization is one of economic marginalization, social exclusion, and environmental destruction. Lhasa, the capital city, is a prime example. The city has seen an exponential urban expansion that has attracted Chinese settlers from all over China. This population shift has transformed the heart of Tibetan culture into another Chinatown, where Tibetans live in small ghettos surrounded by an expanding urban China. We fear that same negative transformation will happen to Shigatse and Chamdo, immeasurably reducing the ability of the Tibetan people to preserve their culture and identity. At the same time, Tibetans equally fear that Chinese settlers will overwhelm and swarm rural and nomadic Tibet. These are some of the many challenges we confront in Tibet. Yet I believe that we have the determination, resolve, and the collective will to surmount them. Tibetans in Tibet have survived one disaster after another. Disasters like the Great Leap Forward in the 1950s and the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s have not shaken the enduring spirit of the Tibetan people. From the martial law imposed in Lhasa in 1989 to the strike hard campaigns to stifle dissent, and campaigns like the Western China Development Program have not diminished the courage of the Tibetan people. From the 1959 uprising, which we honor today, through the decades of peaceful protests, including the 2008 Pan-Tibet demonstration and more than 100 self-immolations, Tibetan will to live as one cohesive people and fight for justice remains firm. In Tibet, artists sing, paint, and write, all with an emboldened spirit and a heightened sense of responsibility to the cause of Tibet. Within Tibet, a new spiritual, cultural, and intellectual renaissance reinforces the Tibetan pride and unity. From the humble gatherers of Yaza Gombo to the tireless truck drivers, farmers and nomads, to monks and nuns, Tibetan talk the night away in common aspirations to live in dignity and with common identity. These pockets of ideas and oases of Tibet's common aspirations will merge into a bright future for all people of Tibet. The rhetoric coming out of China today is that Tibetans have become their own masters. To make this rhetoric a reality, we urge the Chinese leadership to let Tibetans govern Tibet. As China plans to observe the 50th anniversary of the so-called Tibet Autonomous Region, hardliners in Beijing should know that repression will only generate resentment. We have noted President Xi Jinping's comment that Tibetan culture and language should be preserved, yet the local authorities' 20-point internal directives in Amdo undermines both. On the part of Kasha, we remain fully committed to the middle way approach of not seeking separation from China, but genuine autonomy for the Tibetan people. In order to realize genuine autonomy for the Tibetan people, the task force held a conclave in the first week of January to undertake an in-depth discussion on the political developments in Tibet, on issues relating to the future of dialogue with the Chinese leadership, and on developments in larger international political landscape. The Tibetan leadership strongly believes that the only way to resolve the issue of Tibet is through dialogue between the envoys of His Holiness Dalai Lama and the representative of the Chinese leadership. The envoys of His Holiness Dalai Lama are ready to engage in dialogue with their Chinese counterpart anytime and any place. In this regard, we remain deeply appreciative of the recent U.S. State Department statement that encourages dialogue between the representative of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Chinese leadership. We believe, I quote here, we believe that all people in PRC would benefit from the fruits of dialogue and urge the Chinese government to seize the opportunity to further engage with the Dalai Lama, unquote. We also welcome the President Barack Obama's comment at the annual breakfast prayer in Washington, D.C., describing His Holiness Dalai Lama as a good friend and a powerful example of what it means to practice compassion and a person who inspires us to speak for the freedom and dignity of all human beings. I'm glad to report that within India, we see increasing awareness of the importance of Tibet and more platforms provided for the discussion of the issue of Tibet. There is also the realization that the Central Tibetan Administration is both a genuinely democratic political entity and an effective one. The pride of our democracy is its public participation, and we continue to encourage the Tibetan public's deeper engagement in the democratic process. This year, the Tibetan people and our friends throughout the world will celebrate His Holiness the Dalai Lama's 80th birthday. On this landmark occasion, we pray for His Holiness the Dalai Lama's long life and continued good health. The hallmark of the Tibetan peoples is nonviolence and the values embraced by our elder generation: humility, integrity, and resilience, which should be emulated by younger generation as well. This is our political capital as well as our political resource. Above all, the first priority of the Kasha is education. In this effort, the Kasha encourages Tibetans from all walks of life to be deeply involved in children's education. I take this opportunity to thank our Tibet support groups from Berlin to Brussels, from Canberra to Cape Town, and from Tokyo to Taipei, in their noble efforts and for supporting justice and freedom for Tibetans. Amid extremism and violent conflicts around the world, Tibet is a model of moderation and nonviolence, which is worthy of your continued support. We also express our profound gratitude to the people and government of India for their generosity and hospitality. Finally, my fellow Tibetans, once again, with profound hope and gratitude, on behalf of 6 million Tibetan people, I offer my sincere prayers for long life of His Holiness the Great 14th Dalai Lama of Tibet. Today, we honor and pay our deepest respects to the brave men and women who sacrificed their lives for the cause of Tibet. With enduring spirit, may all Tibetans remain steadfast to the cause our forefathers and mothers, our sisters and brothers, and to all those who have devoted their lives to end the sufferings of Tibetans and restore freedom for Tibet. Thank you very much.
다른 게 제림 타마델라 벽이 도가 속반에 덴식 명람 숨구던데 상마 고생 더 냠도 우르된 남겨.
At the end of this event, the Tibetan Institute of Performing Arts will begin to say the prayer of truth. With this, we have come to the end of the event. We thank you all for being with us.